The question of the pupil. I have read the Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson by Gurdjieff, as you have suggested, a number of times in different circumstances, at different speeds and so on. And the impression I have from this is that the problem we have as human beings here on the earth is defined in this book as the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. The crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. Could we say, therefore, that the work upon oneself that we are doing is aimed at challenging these crystallised consequences and with a view to eventually eradicating them? Is this Gurdjieff's teaching? The teacher replies, in 2025 I was able again to attend what is known as the All and Everything Conference. This is a conference held every year, and its stated aim, or at least its stated aim, was that it was on the writings of G.I. Gurdjieff. This was explicitly stated as the purpose, as it were, of this conference. The conference was held 2025 in Leeds in the northeast of England. I live in the northeast of England, so it was less than 100 miles from my home, so I had no excuse not to attend this conference. And I attended this conference, and there arose a situation in this conference which was very strange, because out of, shall we say, 60 attendees who were all attending a conference on the writings of G.I. Gurdjieff, who we can assume had all read Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, apart from 2 attending that conference, one of whom was me, they all had the impression, indeed we might even say a conviction, that Gurdjieff had written that what is wrong with us is the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. So if there were, shall we say, 60, only 2 knew that this was completely untrue. The other 58, having read Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, and you yourself, as your question suggests, still believed, or came to the belief, and still believed, that Gurdjieff had written that the problem we have is the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. And I was able to point out, supported by one other person at that conference, with evidence, I was able to point out that this is not what Gurdjieff writes. Gurdjieff says it is not the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. So my first answer to your question is to say, it is not the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. And this is what Gurdjieff writes, that it's not this. So if we ask what is wrong with us, according to Gurdjieff, that is to say, in the book The Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson by Gurdjieff, Gurdjieff's own writings, what does Gurdjieff say is wrong with us? What does Beelzebub say is wrong with us? So I was able to point out the 3 initial occasions in this book where Gurdjieff says it is not the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. And in answer to your question, it would be perhaps useful to repeat this and point out that even in the early chapters of this book, Beelzebub says, that is to say, Gurdjieff is saying, it's not the crystallized consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. So listen carefully to what Gurdjieff has written. Listen carefully to what Beelzebub says. And I'll read to you and try and show you those first three occasions where Gurdjieff says it is not the crystallized consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. And just before I do so, I say it's extraordinary that out of, shall we say, 60 attendees of this conference, 58 of them had come away from this book believing that this was the problem, the crystallized consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. And it's not. So let's look at those examples now. Now the first one is from the major chapter in this book, which is chapter 13, which appears, superficially at least, very short. Only a couple of pages, 2 or 3 pages. And in this chapter 13, this is page 104 in my copy of this book, Gurdjieff writes this. Excuse me. Concerning all this, whatever it is he's talking about, it must be said, and here we have it, that neither the organ Kundabuffer, which their ancestors had, is to blame, nor its consequences. Let me read that again. I'll read you the whole quote in a moment, but concerning all this, it must be said that neither the organ Kundabuffer nor its consequences are to blame. It's explicit. So it contradicts totally your own question. Concerning all this, it must be said that neither the organ Kundabuffer, which their ancestors had, is to blame, nor its consequences, which, owing to a mistake on the part of certain sacred individuals, were crystallized in their ancestors, and later began to pass by heredity from generation to generation. But, and here we come to what is wrong with us, because it's not the organ Kundabuffer nor its consequences, but they themselves were personally to blame for it. And just on account of, wait for it, what is wrong with us? And just on account of the abnormal conditions of external, ordinary being existence, which they themselves have gradually established. So it's not the organ Kundabuffer nor its consequences, but we ourselves personally are to blame. And why? On account of the abnormal conditions of external, ordinary being existence which we ourselves have gradually established. And that's a phrase that occurs again and again and again in this book. I've said elsewhere, I've said over a number of years, even decades, that it occurs 150 times in this book. The abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. That's what's wrong with us. And it's explicit here in chapter 13, which is not very far into this book. So there's no excuse for anyone, whether they're at a Gurdjieff conference or whether they're asking me questions, to suggest that the problem we have is the crystallized consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. There's no excuse for that. You've read the book. This is what it says. It is not the organ Kundabuffer nor its consequences. What is the problem? The abnormal conditions of external, ordinary being existence that we ourselves have established. So let's look at the other two examples where Gurdjieff says, it is not the organ Kundabuffer nor its consequences. Now the other two quotes are not so specific. We've already seen this quote that it is not the organ Kundabuffer nor its consequences. It is the abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence that we establish for ourselves. And it's this second phrase that we look for and find in the chapter on time. Now this is not actually a long way into the book. It is before the difficult chapters begin. It is before the chapter entitled The Arch Absurd. It is before the chapter entitled The Arch Preposterous, which starts to become difficult when you're reading this book. So it's amongst the easier to understand, apparently, chapters of this book. So it's from the chapter A Relative Understanding of Time. In my book it's page 130, 131. Let me read this. Let me see if I can find it. And meanwhile, remember, he says, this is Beelzebub speaking, chapter on time. And meanwhile, remember that although the fundamental motives for the diminution of the duration of the existence of the three brain beings of this planet, that is to say, the shortening of our lives until we live now only 70 or 80 years, some are luckier, and, shall I say, don't live that long, or are luckier and live longer. But the fundamental motives for the diminution of the duration of the existence of the three brain beings of this planet were from causes not depending on them. That is to say, it was the organ Kundabuffer and its consequences as the fundamental cause. Yet, nevertheless, subsequently, Gurdjieff writes, the main grounds for all the sad results were, and particularly now continue to be, the abnormal conditions of external, ordinary being existence established by them themselves. So there again we have that phrase, the abnormal conditions of external, ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. So although the organ Kundabuffer and its consequences was the fundamental cause of all the sad results, it's actually now not that. It is these abnormal conditions of external ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. We establish them. Now, further down the page, 132, the chief causes for the developing of further ills, that is to say, after the organ Kundabuffer, after its consequences, the chief causes for the developing of further ills are only those, and here we have the same phrase, I've said it 150 times in this book, abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence which they themselves gradually established, and which they continue to establish down to the present time. So again, it's not the organ Kundabuffer, it's not the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. Indeed, we could say it's no longer the organ Kundabuffer, it's no longer the consequences crystallised of that organ Kundabuffer. It is those abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence which they themselves gradually established and which they continue to establish down to the present time. So, what is wrong with us? I go back to your question. You are wrong to say that what is wrong with us is the crystallised consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. We can see in this book 150 times, and I've given 3 examples in the easy chapters of this book. It is the abnormal conditions of external, ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. That's what's wrong with us. So we need to look at this phrase, which I say occurs in this book 150 times, in detail. What does this phrase mean? What exactly is wrong with us? So, if we look at this, we have this Gurdjieff conference, last year in fact in Leeds. And the majority, the grand majority, the vast majority of those attending that conference on the writings of G.I. Gurdjieff, having therefore read, one assumes, the tales of Beelzebub to his grandson, arrived at that conference and were involved in that conference with the belief that the problem we have is the crystallized consequences of the organ Kundabuffer. And if you've read that book, you will know what I'm talking about. If you haven't read that book, read it, and then you will know what I'm talking about. It's not my job to tell you what that is. My job here is to say that that's not true. And it's explicit from chapter 13, which is not very far into this book. It's a big book, and chapter 13 is not very far into this book, and chapter 13 is a very short chapter, where Gurdjieff, through his mouthpiece, as it were, Beelzebub, says it is not the organ Kundabuffer, nor its consequences, that is the problem. It is not the crystallized consequences of the organ Kundabuffer, nor its consequences, and so on. So, what is it? And we get this phrase that occurs again and again. I've said 150 times, I could say 167 times, I could fix it in your mind, say it's 152 times, maybe it's 147 times. The abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence, excuse my voice, established by us ourselves, by them themselves, Beelzebub says. It is the abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. What on earth does this mean? Well, it's not that difficult, and this is what I'm talking about. There is a break, this is Gurdjieff's teaching, there is a break in the chain of energetic production in us. We don't have the energies we should have. We fall in our lives quite quickly, or perhaps slower. We fall to a very low energetic level, in which we are trapped in internal structures from which we cannot escape. That is to say, we cannot maintain ourselves, we don't have the energies to do so. We fall to a very low energetic level. We don't have the energies to maintain ourselves as distinct from these internal structures. As Gurdjieff says, we're totally identified with these structures. We are three-brained beings, three-centered beings. It's a structure. We have two consciousnesses having nothing in common. The theme running through the whole of Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. It's a structure. We fall into these structures, which are totally abnormal. And as a consequence of this, because we don't have the energy to exist, we don't exist, Gurdjieff says, we don't have the energies to exist as independent individuals. Apart from these structures, we are identified with these structures, we have an abnormal psychology. We have to create in ourselves an abnormal psychology. What does Gurdjieff write? The abnormal, external, that it's not us. So we're creating abnormally, outside of ourselves, something that's not us, a false, fictitious and unreal conscious mind at a lower level than we should be. The abnormal external conditions of ordinary, that's the ordinary man, not the normal man. Not the ordinary man is abnormal. Not the normal man. The normal man would be as we should be. But the ordinary, so the abnormal, external, it's not us. Conditions of ordinary. We're ordinary men and women at a very low level, a very low energetic level. So the abnormal, external conditions of ordinary being existence, how we live our lives, established by us ourselves. We create this false conscious mind in ourselves. We have two conscious minds. We create a false conscious mind at a very low level. That's the mind we inhabit now. That's the mind everyone around us inhabits. At a very low energetic level, we create it, and we live in that false consciousness. This is what Gurdjieff was showing Ouspensky. This is the teaching in the book In Search of the Miraculous, a book that was not written by Gurdjieff, but was written by Ouspensky, who misinterpreted and misunderstood Gurdjieff, but nevertheless recorded exactly what Gurdjieff said. This book very exact, Gurdjieff said this, about the book In Search of the Miraculous. So we live, Gurdjieff writes, or Beelzebub says, however you wish to deal with this book. Beelzebub says, we live in the abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. We create a false, fictitious and unreal conscious mind at a lower level, a very low energetic level, which is totally abnormal. It's abnormal, that's the word in it. We live in the abnormal, external conditions of ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. It's abnormal. Because it's at such a low level, and because we therefore become trapped in these internal structures from which we cannot escape. We can't maintain ourselves as independent from these structures. So it falls into place in the tales of Beelzebub to his grandson. It's worded in a way that is totally objective. But in Search of the Miraculous, we start to see a more subjective picture of this, because Gurdjieff had to explain it personally to Ouspensky, personally to Anna Budkowski, and personally to perhaps other people. But we see how the two books are actually connected, because the massive teaching that Gurdjieff is giving, he is starting to give to Ouspensky. Ouspensky misinterprets and misunderstands it. We can deal with this because we have the book The Tales of Beelzebub to His Grandson, published in 1950. We can read it. We can deal with this. But they are saying the same thing. There is a break in the chain of energetic production in us. We don't have the energies we should have, coming from the food of impressions and coming from perception. We therefore energetically fall to a very low level, in which, in order to live in the world, we are forced to create a false, fictitious and unreal conscious mind at a very low level. We have two conscious minds having nothing in common. We've left our true conscious mind behind a long time ago. It's at a much higher level. And we don't have the energies to work at that level. So we fall to this very low level. And in the book, The Tales of Beelzebub to His Grandson, this is what Gurdjieff says 149 times, 132 times, 275 times, I don't know. But what he says is that we live in the abnormal, external conditions outside of us. The abnormal, we're abnormal, external, outside of us. Conditions of ordinary, we're ordinary men and women at a very low level. Being existence, how we exist in the world, established by us ourselves. We create this conscious mind at a very low level because that's the only way we can live in the world. But there is another way, and that is to remedy the break in the chain of energetic production in us. What is this break in the chain of energetic production in us? It is we don't receive the food of impressions as we should. coming from perception. So the whole teaching then moves on to a teaching that Gurdjieff didn't give concerning perception. That's the teaching that I'm giving. That's my teaching. It's a teaching about perception and how to remedy this break in the chain of energetic production in us. It's no good me going on and on and on, as I do, about Gurdjieff's teaching or Ouspensky's teaching, or the differences between these two completely different teachings. It's time to move on and say, this is my teaching. It's about perception. It's about how to remedy this break in the chain of energetic production in us, so that we can raise the energetic level of the whole organism up to a new level, the normal level. And only then can our own individual development begin.